some truths don't stay buried, no matter who tries. Welcome to Echoes of Clues. I am your host, Shadow Teller. Tell me below where you're tuning in from. I love seeing your messages. Let's uncover it. There was, as Mrs. Elspeth Wren often said, a right way and a wrong way to arrange sponge cakes on a trestle table, and the committee for the St. Anne's summer fete had, in her opinion, chosen the wrong way with a confidence that was almost theatrical. She stood beneath the striped awning on the vicarage lawn, one gloved hand resting lightly on the handle of her walking stick, and regarded the cake stall with a gaze so mild that no one ever suspected how much it noticed. Around her, the fete was opening into one of those golden village afternoons that seemed composed entirely of bunting, brass polish, and small domestic tensions disguised as cheerfulness. Children ran in bright, shrill knots between stalls. A dog barked indignantly near the tombola. Somewhere beyond the rose hedge, the church bells had only just finished their quarter hour, and the brass band from Much Woldingham, having taken their places near the cedar tree, were puffing themselves into a hymn tune with more determination than harmony. "Too close together," murmured Mrs. Wren. Her companion, Mrs. Beatrice Finch, who had the sort of curiosity that moved faster than either her good sense or her feet, looked up at once. "What is?" "The cakes. It makes the Victoria sponge appear defensive. One should never make a sponge cake seem nervous." Mrs. Finch stared, then laughed, as almost everyone did when Mrs. Wren said something that sounded foolish. Yet, as often happened, now she found herself looking more carefully at the stall and thinking there might be something in it after all. "Oh, Elspeth, you do say things," she replied, "though I dare say no one will notice. They'll be far too occupied with the raffle. Have you seen the silver frame? Quite handsome. Donated anonymously, they say." "Nothing in a village is anonymous for long," said Mrs. Wren. This was true enough in Barrow Street, Jude, where the population was not large enough to support true privacy and not kind enough to ignore the lack of it. The village lay in a fold of green country some miles from the nearest market town, with a square church tower, a duck pond that had aspirations to beauty, and a high street lined with flint cottages so picturesque that strangers often imagined the inhabitants must therefore be happy. They rarely were. And at the center of that day's activity stood the vicarage lawn, broad and slightly sloping, bounded by old yew hedges and a row of lime trees whose leaves whispered above the gossip below. The fete was the great summer event, nominally held in aid of roof repairs for the church hall, though many suspected that it was really maintained to provide the village with a respectable arena in which to observe one another. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clare Pritchard, moved briskly from stall to stall with a clipboard and the strained smile of a woman who had long ago learned that charity events brought out less Christian feeling than one might hope. Her husband, the Reverend Daniel Pritchard, followed at a less useful pace, carrying a coil of bunting and looking apologetic to the world at large. Near the tea tent, Miss Lydia Vale was supervising the placement of cups with the composure of a minor queen. She was a striking woman in her early 30s, dark-haired and self-contained, with a face that seemed to some people handsome and to others proud. She had come to Barrow Street, Jude, only 18 months before, after taking over as headmistress of the village school, and had never quite ceased being discussed. At the far edge of the lawn, beside the white-painted gate, Mr. Julian Harcourt arrived 10 minutes late, and as if lateness were a privilege. He was tall, agreeable in manner, and expensively careless in dress. Though he was still some years short of 40, there was already something faintly used about his charm, as though it had been too often employed and too seldom earned. He owned Harcourt House, on the rise above the village, and a handsome Georgian place with cracked greenhouses and increasing financial difficulties, though one never mentioned the latter directly. In a village, there were facts one knew and subjects one pretended not to. "Here he is," whispered Mrs. Finch, with that brightening of tone that indicated scandal might at any moment become available. "And she's here too." Mrs. Wren did not ask who she was. Mrs. Finch always preferred to reveal information in layers, like a child unwrapping sweets. On cue, a motor car came round the lane and drew up by the gate. From it emerged Mrs. Celia Harcourt, Julian's wife, in a pale blue dress and an expression of composed fatigue. She was beautiful in the delicate, costly way that made one think of porcelain and the dangers of handling it. But one had the impression that she had once expected life to be simpler than it had turned out to be. Her husband went forward at once, smiling. "My dear, we thought you'd deserted us." "I nearly did," she said. The words were light. The tone was not. Only a very attentive person would have noticed it. Mrs. Elspeth Wren noticed everything that belonged to tone. Julian laughed and leaned in to kiss his wife's cheek. She permitted it with the same resignation one might show a public ceremony long stripped of meaning. A second later, she turned away and said something to Lydia Vale, who had approached from the tea tent. The two women were not intimate, but there was, between them, the ease of those who have privately agreed on at least one important opinion about the same man. Mrs. Finch followed the line of Mrs. Wren's gaze. You don't think—" "I very seldom think what people mean when they ask that question," said Mrs. Wren. "I generally think something much smaller." Mrs. Finch sighed. "Well, I think there has been trouble at Harcourt House for months. Cook told Ivy at the post office that tradesmen have been kept waiting, and the gardener has not been paid since April." Mrs. Wren made no reply. She was watching Mr. Leonard Pike, the village chemist, who had just arrived carrying 2 trays of raffle prizes with the careful expression of a man transporting nitroglycerin. Mr. Pike was unmarried, precise, and habitually correct. He had been born in the village, left it for 20 years, and returned with a little more money and a great deal more caution. He nodded to Lydia Vale. She returned the greeting with civility, though not warmth. "Another one," said Mrs. Finch under her breath. "My dear Beatrice, by your system, though every person in England is either having an affair or about to confess to one." Mrs. Finch looked faintly disappointed that this had not been accepted as probable. The fate gathered itself. Tickets were sold. Jams were judged. Small boys spent money on coconut shies with the ferocity of gamblers. The band, having completed one march and damaged another, began something patriotic. On the church path, Mrs. Agnes Tolliver, whose hearing was poor and whose certainty was excellent, told anyone who would stand still long enough that village events had been better run before the war, though she was never entirely clear which war she meant. At 2:30, the official opening took place. Sir Matthew Creed, the chairman of the parish council and owner of the local milling works, stepped onto the little wooden platform erected beside the vicarage rose beds. He was a broad, florid man with a prosperous voice and a fondness for public duty, so long as it was visible from several angles. "My friends," he boomed, raising one hand. A child cried. Someone dropped a spoon. A gust of wind flipped the edge of the bunting and immediately subsided, as if out of respect. "We gather today in fellowship." "Always a dangerous beginning," murmured Mrs. Wren, "for the good of our village and our church community." Sir Matthew continued in this vein, thanking donors, volunteers, ladies of the floral committee, and unnamed others whose efforts, though quiet, had made the afternoon possible. And his eye passed over Julian Harcourt with a pause that was perhaps accidental and perhaps not. There had been business between the two men at one time. Lately they had become conspicuously civil. When the speech at last ended, applause rose and broke in pleasant fragments. A maypole dance by the school children followed, organized by Lydia Vale with military grace and maternal patience in equal parts. Colored ribbons crossed and tightened. Tiny shoes stumbled, corrected themselves, and went on. Parents smiled with proprietary emotion. A photographer from the county paper took notes no one believed he would later decipher. Mrs. Wren, who disliked crowds but approved of patterns, watched the weaving of the ribbons with real attention. "Funny," she said. Mrs. Finch had by now acquired a paper cup of tea and a custard tart, asked and managed to look inquisitive while balancing both. "What is?" "When children dance the maypole, the one who makes the mistake is often not the one everyone blames." Mrs. Finch opened her mouth, shut it, and turned to the maypole in the hope of discovering what on earth that might mean. But the dance ended cleanly, to applause, and the children ran off in relieved disorder. A little later, when the crowd dispersed toward the tea tent and raffle table, Mrs. Wren strolled, if so deliberate a progress could be called strolling, toward the far border where sweet peas climbed a wire frame beside the side path to the orchard. The lawn was lively, but here the sounds softened. Voices came and went through the hedge breaks. The bees were busy among the late lavender. From the orchard beyond came the dry fall of an apple dropping too early. And it was there she saw Celia Harcourt standing partly screened by the sweet peas, speaking in a low, urgent voice to Leonard Pike. The chemist's face was pale with discomfort. "I have told you," he was saying, "I can do no more. It would be highly improper." "Improper?" Celia's laugh was brittle. "That seems a very ornamental objection at present. Please do not speak so loudly. No one can hear." Mrs. Wren, who heard perfectly well, adjusted her glove with interest. Mr. Pike lowered his voice further, but not enough. "I gave you my advice. You chose not to follow it. And if I had?" He did not answer. A second later, he glanced sharply toward the hedge, and Celia turned. For one instant, her face, stripped of its social expression, showed something raw and frightened. Then she saw only Mrs. Wren emerging at an amble from the side path. "My dear Mrs. Wren," she said almost immediately, "how nice to see you. Are you hiding from the speeches?" "One does so much better without them," said Mrs. Wren pleasantly. Mr. Pike muttered something about the raffle books and moved off. Celia watched him go with compressed lips. Then she smiled, but it was the sort of smile one remembers afterward because it had cost too much. "You must excuse me. I'm due at the cake stall." She walked away before Mrs. Wren could reply. Mrs. Wren remained where she was a moment longer. She looked down and noticed that one of the sweet pea canes had been snapped near the base. Not newly, but within the hour. Beside it, half hidden in the grass, lay a man's matchbook, dark green, with the gold crest of Harcourt House stamped upon it. She bent carefully, picked it up, and turned it over in her hand. "How interesting," she said to no one. By 4 o'clock, clouds had drifted over from the west, softening the sun without threatening rain. The tea tent was in full operation. Lydia Vale poured tea with controlled efficiency. Claire Pritchard cut slices of seed cake. Mrs. Tolliver complained that the cups were too modern. Julian Harcourt moved from table to table, charming elderly subscribers who had once disliked his father and now enjoyed disapproving of the son. At a corner table near the hedge sat a quiet man whom few villagers knew well, Mr. Adrian Bell, a recent lodger at the old Dower cottage. He wrote articles, people said, or perhaps books. His appearance gave little away beyond tired intelligence and the kind of reserve that invites speculation. He had been in the village only 6 weeks and already knew enough to regret it, and Julian approached him with expansive friendliness. "Bell, hiding yourself away?" "Observing," said Adrian Bell. "Dangerous habit here." "So I'm learning." Julian smiled, but his eyes were watchful. "You promised you'd look over those papers for me." "When I have time." "One would think," said Julian lightly, "that time is the one thing a writer possesses in criminal abundance." Adrian Bell looked up. "One would think a good many foolish things." The exchange lasted only seconds, but it carried a current sharp enough to be felt across the table. Julian laughed again and moved on. Not far away, Miss Lydia Vale had seen it too. She turned slightly, met Adrian Bell's gaze for the briefest moment, then looked away. The look was not romantic. It was worse than that. It was understanding. Mrs. Finch Yes, who saw nearly everything but arranged it badly, leaned toward Mrs. Wren and whispered, "There is something most peculiar about that man in the dower cottage. He never attends anything, and yet he's here. Why would he come if not for a reason?" "There is almost always a reason," said Mrs. Wren. "The trouble is that it is not always the one people choose because they like it best." Mrs. Finch blinked. "Do you suspect him?" "My dear, I suspect nearly everybody of something. It saves time." The raffle was drawn at 5. The prizes, arranged on a long table under the main awning, had attracted a dense and eager crowd. Children pressed forward to see whether the giant tin of toffees would be theirs. Mrs. Tolliver insisted on standing directly in front of the ticket drum. Sir Matthew Creed had resumed his public voice. Claire Pritchard, Mrs. Flushed and Weary, held the list of numbers. The silver frame went to Mrs. Henshaw, the hamper to the doctor's wife. The fishing rod produced laughter when won by a woman who detested rivers. There was cheering, clapping, and the mild protest that accompanies all village raffles, as if fairness itself were always slightly under suspicion. Then, just as Sir Matthew reached for the final ticket, first prize, a case of old claret donated from the Harcourt cellar, there came a sound from beyond the yew hedge bordering the orchard path. It was not a scream. That would have been simpler. It was a short, strangled cry, immediately cut off. For one suspended instant, no one moved. The band stopped in the middle of a note. A child laughed because he thought something had been dropped. Then Claire Pritchard said, quite clearly, "What was that?" Someone pushed through the side gap in the hedge. It was one of the village boys from the coconut shy, white-faced and panting. "There's a man down," he gasped. "In the orchard. Someone's lying there." The crowd broke all at once into confused motion. Men surged toward the path. Women called out questions. Chairs overturned in the tea tent. The vicar, looking suddenly less apologetic and more useful, hurried forward. Sir Matthew jumped from the platform with surprising agility for his build. Mrs. Wren did not hurry. She never did. Instead, she turned her head and looked, not toward the orchard path, but toward the people nearest it when the cry had sounded. Celia Harcourt had gone very still, one hand gripping the edge of the raffle table so tightly that her knuckles shone white. Leonard Pike had instinctively stepped backward. Lydia Vale's face had altered, not with shock alone, but with something like recognition. Adrian Bell, near the tea tent, had half risen and then stopped, as though some private calculation had intervened. And Julian Harcourt. Julian Harcourt was not there. Mrs. Wren's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. A moment later the cry came from the orchard, louder now and unmistakable. "Doctor! For God's sake! Doctor!" The village, which only a minute before had been occupied with sponge cakes and raffled tickets and the proper management of fête day civility, understood in one dreadful shiver that something final had entered the afternoon. Mrs. Finch caught Mrs. Wren's arm. "Elspeth, do you think it's serious?" Mrs. Wren was still holding the green matchbook from Harcourt House in her gloved hand. I think," she said softly, "that the fete has ended." The first to reach the orchard were the younger men, driven by that restless urgency which prefers action to understanding. Others followed more cautiously, parting the low-hanging branches and stepping over fallen fruit with the uneasy awareness that something irreversible lay ahead. The air beneath the trees was cooler, tinged with the faint, sweet rot of early apples, and the hum of insects seemed suddenly intrusive, as though nature had failed to observe propriety. Dr. Hargreaves, stout and practical, was already kneeling beside the figure on the ground when Mrs. Wren and Mrs. Finch arrived at the edge of the clearing. The doctor's hat lay discarded nearby, and his bag had been opened with such haste that several instruments had spilled into the grass. "Stand back. Please," he said sharply, though his tone carried less authority than usual. There was no need to insist. The expression on his face had already begun to arrange the truth for them. The man lying on the ground was Sir Matthew Creed. He lay on his side, One arm twisted awkwardly beneath him, his broad frame now disturbingly slack, as though something essential had been quietly removed. His florid complexion had taken on a dull, mottled cast, and there was a faint mark visible just below his left ear, a small, precise discoloration that did not belong to accident. Mrs. Finch gave a low cry. Oh, how dreadful! He was just speaking, only moments ago. Mrs. Wren did not answer. Her gaze rested not on the face of the dead man, but on the ground around him. The grass was flattened in a narrow line leading toward the hedge, as though someone had moved quickly through it. A fallen branch had been snapped, not broken by weight, but sharply, cleanly, as if struck aside. Nearby, half hidden among the leaves, was a small indentation in the earth, the sort made by the heel of a shoe pressed down with sudden force. Dr. Hargreaves rose slowly, removing his spectacles and wiping them with unnecessary care. "He's gone," he said. The words settled heavily over the small group that had gathered, as if they were objects with weight rather than sound. "Gone?" repeated Mrs. Tolliver, who had arrived despite all attempts to prevent her. "Nonsense! He was opening the raffle. People don't simply—" "No," said the doctor, more firmly now. "He is dead." There was a murmur, sharp and immediate, breaking into fragments of disbelief. But how— was it his heart? Someone should fetch the police. Of course the police. This must be. The doctor raised a hand. "Please, there will be time for all that. For now, no one is to touch anything." Mrs. Wren's eyes moved from the mark on Sir Matthew's neck to the doctor's face. "Not his heart, then?" she asked gently. Dr. Hargreaves hesitated, just long enough. "No," he said at last. "I don't believe so." A silence followed that was deeper than the first. It was no longer confusion but recognition of something deliberate, something arranged. Mrs. Finch clutched her arm. "Elspeth, do you mean—" "I very seldom mean anything until I am quite certain," said Mrs. Wren. "But it would be unwise to suppose this was natural." Behind them, more villagers had begun to gather, their earlier excitement transformed into a different kind of urgency, one that fed on speculation rather than festivity. Claire Pritchard stood near the path, pale but composed, directing people away with quiet insistence. The vicar hovered beside her, murmuring reassurances that convinced no one. Leonard Pike appeared at the edge of the group, his face drained of color. He took one look at the body and turned sharply away, pressing a handkerchief to his mouth. Celia Harcourt arrived moments later. She did not cry out. She did not rush forward. Instead, she stopped several paces from the body, her gaze fixed upon Sir Matthew with an intensity that seemed almost analytical. "How did it happen?" she asked. No one answered at once. Dr. Hargreaves cleared his throat. "We don't yet know." Celia's eyes flickered briefly toward the mark on the neck, then away again. "No," she said softly. "I suppose not." Mrs. Wren watched her with interest. A rustle of movement came from the path as Julian Harcourt pushed through the hedge, slightly out of breath. "What is all this?" he demanded, though his voice carried an odd restraint, as if he already suspected the answer. He saw the body, stopped, and for a moment his expression was perfectly blank. Then he stepped forward. "Good God," he said quietly. "Matthew." There was something in the way he spoke the name. Not shock exactly, but recognition of a different order that caused Mrs. Wren to tilt her head ever so slightly. "You weren't at the raffle," said Adrian Bell from behind him. Julian turned. "I beg your pardon." "The raffle," Bell repeated. "Sis, you were expected to present the final prize, I believe." "I was detained," said Julian, a shade too quickly. "I stepped away for a moment." "Indeed," said Bell. The word was mild, but it lingered. Lydia Vale had come up beside Mrs. Wren now, her expression controlled, though her eyes were bright with something sharper than fear. "This will ruin everything," she said under her breath. "My dear Miss Vale," said Mrs. Wren, "I should think something rather more serious has already been ruined." Lydia gave a short, strained laugh, then fell silent. From somewhere beyond the trees came the distant sound of a motor car being started. Someone had already gone for the police. Mrs. Wren glanced once more at the ground, at the broken branch, the disturbed grass, the small, almost invisible mark on the dead man's neck. Then she looked at the people, at Celia Harcourt standing very still, at Leonard Pike, who could not bring himself to look again, at Julian, whose charm had slipped just enough to reveal something harder beneath, at Adrian Bell, watching everything, at Lydia Vale, who seemed to understand more than she wished. "Such a pity," murmured Mrs. Wren. Mrs. Finch turned to her. "What is?" "That people so often assume," said Mrs. Wren quietly, "that the important thing is what has happened." She paused, her gaze resting briefly on the orchard gate, then on the path beyond it. "When, in fact," she added, "it is almost always who knew it would happen that matters most." The orchard did not empty at once, though reason and propriety urged it. People lingered at the edges, drawn by that peculiar gravity which tragedy exerts upon the living. Their voices dropped to whispers that carried farther than speech, and the earlier gaiety of the fete seemed to have retreated not merely from the lawn, but from the day itself. Dr. Hargreaves had covered Sir Matthew with a folded tablecloth brought hurriedly from the tea tent. It lay awkwardly across the body, insufficiently concealing its outline, as though even in death Sir Matthew retained something of his public presence. The doctor stood near it, speaking in low tones to the vicar, while Claire Pritchard attempted, with quiet determination, to guide the villagers back toward the lawn. "No good will come of standing about," she said more than once. "Please, let us keep the path clear." It was sensible advice, though not immediately obeyed. Mrs. Wren, who had remained a little apart, now moved slowly along the edge of the clearing, her gaze lowered as if in idle contemplation. In reality, she was observing with the utmost care. Near the broken branch, she paused. The ground there bore more signs of disturbance than were visible at first glance. The flattened grass did not spread evenly. It suggested direction. Someone had not merely passed through, it had been done quickly, with purpose. There was also, just beyond the indentation she had noticed before, a second mark, lighter but unmistakable, the narrow imprint of a woman's shoe. Mrs. Wren's eyes flickered briefly toward the assembled group. Celia Harcourt stood slightly apart from the others, her arms folded, her posture composed but not at ease. Her shoes, elegant, pale, and quite unsuitable for orchard paths, were faintly scuffed at the edges. "Curious," murmured Mrs. Wren. "What is?" asked Mrs. Finch, who had followed, though she kept glancing nervously toward the covered body. "Only that people seldom go where it is inconvenient without a reason." Mrs. Finch frowned. "You don't think she—" "My dear Beatrice, I think nothing yet, but I observe that she has been where she ought not to have been." Before Mrs. Finch could respond, there was a stir at the path. A motor car had arrived, and with it 2 uniformed constables, followed shortly by a taller man in plain clothes who moved with quiet authority. Inspector Gareth Cole. He was not from the village, but from the nearest town, and his presence seemed to bring with it a shift in atmosphere. Where there had been confusion, there was now direction. Where speculation had flourished, it began, reluctantly, to retreat. "Good afternoon," he said, though there was nothing of greeting in the words. "I understand we have an incident." Dr. Hargreaves stepped forward. "Yes, Sir Matthew Creed. Found here not 10 minutes ago, I believe." He hesitated, then continued, "I believe the cause is not natural." Inspector Cole nodded once, his expression unreadable. "No one is to leave the grounds," he said. turning slightly so that his voice carried to the edge of the gathering. "I will need to speak to everyone who was present." A murmur of protest rose and fell. No one truly objected. They merely wished it known that they might have done so. The inspector knelt beside the body, lifting the edge of the cloth with care. His gaze rested briefly on the mark at the neck, then moved to the surrounding ground, the broken branch, the flattened grass. He rose again, brushing his hands together. "Is who found him?" The boy from the coconut shy was brought forward, pale and eager, recounting his discovery in a rush of words that tumbled over one another. The inspector listened without interruption, then asked a few precise questions, fixing times, positions, movements. "And before that," he said, "who last saw Sir Matthew alive?" There was a pause. "At the raffle," said Claire Pritchard. "He was on the platform. Everyone saw him." "Yes, but who spoke to him last? Who was nearest?" Julian Harcourt stepped forward. "I was with him earlier," he said smoothly. "Just before the drawing began, we were discussing the final prize." Inspector Cole regarded him. "And after that?" "I left briefly. I needed some air." "Did you come this way?" Julian hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. "No. Toward the side path, by the orchard gate." Mrs. Wren's gaze sharpened. "The same direction," she murmured softly, "but not quite the same place." "What do you mean?" whispered Mrs. Finch. "Only that people are often very particular in their descriptions when they wish to avoid something." Inspector Cole turned. "Did anyone else see Sir Matthew leave the platform?" "I did," said Lydia Vale. All eyes shifted to her. "He stepped down," she continued, her voice steady, "and moved toward the hedge. I assumed he was going to speak with someone." "Did you see who?" "No." The inspector studied her for a moment, then nodded. "And you, Mrs. Harcourt?" Celia met his gaze without flinching. "I saw nothing," she said. It was a simple answer. Too simple. Mrs. Wren looked once more at the scuffed shoes, the disturbed grass, the narrow imprint half hidden beneath a fallen leaf, and then she lifted her head and allowed her gaze to travel quite innocently across the assembled faces. "Such a great many people," she said quietly to Mrs. Finch, "and yet only one of them needed to be here at exactly the right moment." She paused, her expression thoughtful. "And I cannot help wondering," she added, "who arranged that moment, and why Sir Matthew agreed to meet them at all." Inspector Cole did not attempt to question everyone at once. That would have produced more confusion than clarity. Instead, he directed that small groups remain near the lawn while he spoke to individuals in turn, beginning with those most closely connected to the dead man. The orchard path became, for the moment, a boundary rather than a thoroughfare. A constable stood at its entrance, quietly but firmly preventing unnecessary movement, so that the fete itself had dissolved into uneasy clusters, people sitting without drinking their tea, standing without speaking, watching without appearing to do so. Mrs. Wren and Mrs. Finch returned slowly to the edge of the lawn. "Well," said Mrs. Finch in a low voice, "this is far worse than anything I imagined. To think, murder, here of all places." "My dear," said Mrs. Wren gently, "places do not prevent such things. They merely make them more inconvenient." Mrs. Finch glanced back toward the orchard. "You really believe it was murder, then?" "I believe," said Mrs. Wren, "that Sir Matthew did not go into that orchard by chance, and that he did not die there by accident. One must begin with what is unlikely." Inspector Cole's voice could be heard from a short distance away as he spoke to Julian Harcourt. "You say you left the platform shortly before the final ticket was drawn?" "Yes." "For how long?" "A few minutes. 5, perhaps." "And during that time, did you see Sir Matthew again?" "No." The inspector's tone remained neutral. "You mentioned taking the side path. Did you meet anyone there?" Julian shook his head. "No one." Mrs. Wren's eyes rested on him thoughtfully. There was nothing overtly wrong in his manner. Indeed, it was admirably controlled, but control itself was sometimes a form of information. Nearby, Lydia Vale was being questioned. "You saw Sir Matthew leave the platform," said the inspector. "Did anything strike you as unusual?" "No," she replied. "Only that he seemed preoccupied." "In what way?" She hesitated, choosing her words. "He was not listening. Someone spoke to him, and he answered, but his attention was elsewhere." "Do you know where?" "No." "Or with whom?" Again that fractional pause. "No." Inspector Cole studied her a moment longer, then made a brief note. Celia Harcourt stood some distance away, waiting her turn. She appeared composed, but there was a faint rigidity about her posture that had not been there earlier, as though she were holding herself very still to prevent something from shifting out of place. Mrs. Wren watched her for a moment, then glanced toward Leonard Pike. The chemist had retreated to the far side of the lawn, near the raffle table. He stood alone, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his gaze fixed not on the orchard, but on the ground at his feet. "Fear," murmured Mrs. Wren. Mrs. Finch followed her gaze. "Of what?" "Of being asked the wrong question." Inspector Cole moved on. "Mrs. Harcourt." Celia stepped forward. "You were present at the raffle?" "Yes." "Did you see Sir Matthew leave the platform?" "I did not notice." "You did not notice?" repeated the inspector. "No." "Where were you looking?" "At the crowd," she said. "At the tickets?" "I cannot say exactly." The inspector regarded her steadily. "Did you speak with Sir Matthew today?" A pause. "Not today," she said. It was a careful answer. Mrs. Wren's head tilted slightly. "Not today," she repeated under her breath. Inspector Cole did not challenge it, though something in his expression suggested he had marked it for later consideration. "And before today?" Celia's gaze did not waver. "We are neighbors. We have spoken on many occasions." "About what?" "Village matters," she said. "Social things." "Nothing of importance?" "No." The inspector nodded once and stepped back. For a brief moment, Celia's composure faltered. Her hand moved as if to adjust her glove, then stilled. Across the lawn, Adrian Bell was watching, not openly, but with a quiet attention that missed very little. When the inspector approached him, he seemed almost to have expected it. "You are Mr. Bell?" "Yes." "You are lodging in the village?" "For the time being." "Your reason for attending the fete?" Bell gave a faint, almost ironic smile. "Curiosity." "About what?" "About villages," he said. The inspector's expression did not change. "And did your curiosity extend to the orchard?" "No." "Did you see Sir Matthew leave the platform?" "Yes." "Did you follow him?" "No." "Did anyone?" Bell's gaze shifted briefly, almost imperceptibly, sighing toward the orchard path. "I believe someone did," he said. Inspector Cole leaned slightly forward. "Who?" Bell met his eyes. "I don't know." It was not, Mrs. Wren thought, entirely untrue. The questioning continued, moving from one person to another, assembling fragments that did not yet align. Time stretched, not forward, but outward, as though the afternoon had been pulled thin over something concealed beneath it. Mrs. Wren folded her hands over the handle of her walking stick. "So many small inaccuracies," she murmured. Mrs. Finch looked at her anxiously. "What do you mean?" "Only that people are already beginning," said Mrs. Wren softly, "to tell the story in a way that suits them." She glanced once more toward the orchard path, where the constable still stood, and beyond it, where the trees held their quiet. "Ah, and when that happens," she added, "one must be very careful to remember that the truth does not change. Only the telling of it does." The light had begun to soften by the time Inspector Cole concluded the first round of questioning. What had been a bright, almost festive afternoon now seemed subdued, as though the village itself had drawn inward. The bunting stirred faintly in the breeze, its colors dulled by the shifting sky, and the sounds of movement were quieter, more deliberate. No one had been permitted to leave. A constable moved quietly among the remaining guests, taking down names and addresses, his pencil scratching with methodical persistence. The vicar had retreated to the edge of the lawn, speaking in low tones to those most visibly shaken. Claire Pritchard continued to manage what remained of order, though her smile had vanished entirely. Mrs. Wren sat on a folding chair near the tea tent, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Mrs. Finch hovered beside her, restless and troubled. "It doesn't make sense," Mrs. Finch whispered. "If someone wished to harm Sir Matthew, why do it here, in the middle of everything?" "My dear," said Mrs. Wren gently, "that is precisely why." Mrs. Finch blinked. "Why?" "Because," said Mrs. Wren, "it allows everyone to believe they would have noticed, if only they had been looking." Mrs. Finch considered this uneasily and glanced toward the orchard. Inspector Cole had returned there, accompanied by Dr. Hargreaves and one of the constables. The body remained where it had been found, though now more carefully observed. The inspector moved slowly around the area, pausing now and then to examine the ground, the broken branch, the narrow path leading toward the hedge. After a moment, he straightened and turned to the doctor. "You're certain about the mark?" Dr. Hargreaves nodded. "Quite. It's not consistent with a fall or natural cause. I should say something sharp and applied with precision. Injection? It's possible." The inspector glanced once more at the small, almost unremarkable discoloration on Sir Matthew's neck. "Then whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing," he said quietly. From the lawn, Mrs. Wren observed this exchange with interest. "Knowledge," she murmured. "That narrows things rather nicely." Mrs. Finch leaned closer. "To whom?" "To those who are not merely impulsive," said Mrs. Wren, "but prepared." Her gaze shifted, settling once more on Leonard Pike. The chemist stood where he had been before, though now Inspector Cole approached him directly. "Mr. Pike," said the inspector, "I understand you are the village chemist." "Yes," Pike replied, his voice tight. "You would, I imagine, be familiar with substances that could produce such an effect." Pike swallowed. "In a professional capacity, yes. Have you noticed anything missing from your stock?" "No," he said quickly. "Certainly not." "Nothing at all?" "No." Inspector Cole regarded him steadily. "You understand, of course, that we will need to verify that." "Of course," Pike said, though the words seemed to cost him something. The inspector nodded and moved on, but the exchange had not gone unnoticed. Mrs. Finch drew in her breath. "You don't think he—" "I think," said Mrs. Wren, "that Mr. Pike is afraid of something. But fear is not the same as guilt." "Then what is he afraid of?" Mrs. Wren's eyes drifted briefly toward Celia Harcourt. "That," she said softly, "is the more interesting question." Celia had withdrawn slightly from the others, and now stood near the edge of the lawn, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the immediate scene. She appeared calm, but there was a tension about her stillness that suggested effort rather than ease. After a moment, she turned and walked toward the tea tent. Mrs. Wren watched her go. "Now that," she said, "is a mistake." "What is?" asked Mrs. Finch. "Leaving before one is called again," said Mrs. Wren. "It suggests either impatience or purpose." Almost immediately, Adrian Bell followed, though at a slower pace, as if his movement were incidental rather than intentional. Mrs. Finch noticed. "He's going after her." "Yes," said Mrs. Wren. "Why?" "I wonder," said Mrs. Wren. A few minutes passed. Then, from within the tea tent, there came the faint murmur of voices, too low to distinguish clearly, but edged with something sharper than ordinary conversation. Mrs. Wren rose. "My dear Beatrice," she said, "I believe we shall take a little walk." But should we? Mrs. Finch hesitated. Oh, yes, said Mrs. Wren pleasantly. I find that when people choose to speak in private at a moment like this, it is very seldom because they have nothing to hide. They moved quietly toward the tent, not directly, but with the unhurried, almost absent-minded air of those who simply happened to be passing by. Inside, partially concealed by the canvas folds, Celia Harcourt stood facing Adrian Bell. You had no right, she was saying, through her voice low but urgent. I had every right, Bell replied calmly. If you had told me the truth earlier, this might have been avoided. Celia's expression tightened. You don't understand. On the contrary, said Bell, I understand very well. There was a pause. Then Celia said, very quietly, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. Mrs. Wren stopped just short of the entrance, her expression thoughtful. Indeed, she murmured under her breath. Not like this at all. Mrs. Wren did not enter. She had never believed in interrupting a conversation at its most revealing point. People so often said less when they were aware of being overheard. Instead, she turned quietly away, as though the matter had lost interest, and resumed her place near the edge of the lawn. Mrs. Finch followed, her curiosity nearly overcoming her restraints. Yes, well, she whispered. What did she mean? It wasn't supposed to happen like this. That sounds, oh, Elspeth, it sounds dreadful. It is dreadful, said Mrs. Wren mildly, but not, I think, in the way you suppose. Mrs. Finch stared. Then how? Mrs. Wren did not answer at once. Her gaze moved slowly across the lawn, the orchard path, the assembled villagers, each in their place, each enclosed within their own version of the afternoon. Inspector Cole was speaking again with Dr. Hargreaves. Leonard Pike stood apart, pale and rigid. Lydia Vale watched everything with strained composure. Adrian Bell had emerged from the tent, his expression unreadable. And Celia Harcourt. Celia had regained her calm, though it sat upon her like something newly borrowed. And Julian Harcourt stood slightly apart from them all. That, Mrs. Wren thought, it was the first true thing. Beatrice, she said quietly, have you ever noticed how often people arrange meetings at inconvenient times? Mrs. Finch blinked. Meetings? Yes, private conversations, urgent discussions, matters that cannot wait. Mrs. Wren's tone was almost conversational. And how very often those meetings take place just when others are occupied, when attention is elsewhere. The raffle, said Mrs. Finch slowly. Precisely. Mrs. Wren tapped her gloved fingers lightly against her walking stick. Sir Matthew was preoccupied, she continued. Miss Vale observed it. He was waiting for something, or someone. He left the platform not by chance, but because he had been asked to do so. By whom? Mrs. Wren's eyes rested briefly on Celia Harcourt. Mrs. Harcourt had reason to meet him, she said. We saw as much earlier. She had already been in the orchard once, and her shoes confirm it, but... She paused. She did not kill him. Mrs. Finch's mouth fell open. But she said... She practically admitted... She admitted, said Mrs. Wren gently, that something had gone wrong, not that she had done it. Mrs. Finch faltered. Then who? Mrs. Wren's gaze shifted. To answer that, she said, one must consider not only who wished Sir Matthew harm, but who knew he would be alone. At that moment, Inspector Cole approached once more. Mrs. Wren, he said, with a hint of respect that had not been present earlier, you have been observing quietly. I wonder, have you noticed anything of use? Mrs. Wren inclined her head slightly. Only a pattern, she said. I should be very interested to hear it. The small circle around them grew almost without intention. The people drew closer, their attention sharpened by the unspoken sense that something was about to be said. Mrs. Wren spoke in her usual gentle tone. Sir Matthew was called away from the raffle. That much is clear. He expected to meet someone in the orchard. Someone he trusted, or at least someone whose request he would not refuse. Inspector Cole nodded. Yes. Mrs. Harcourt arranged such a meeting, Mrs. Wren continued. She had reason to speak with him privately. We saw her in the orchard earlier, and Mr. Pike's distress suggests that the matter concerned something serious, perhaps even dangerous. Celia's face tightened, but she did not speak. However, Mrs. Wren went on, Mrs. Harcourt did not meet Sir Matthew at the appointed moment. She was delayed, or prevented. A flicker of something passed across Adrian Bell's face. And yet, said the inspector, Sir Matthew still went. Because, said Mrs. Wren softly, someone else knew of the meeting. There was a pause. Someone, she continued, who understood its importance. Someone who had both the knowledge and the means to act, and the opportunity to arrive first. Her eyes settled at last on Julian Harcourt. He smiled faintly. My dear Mrs. Wren, you cannot possibly be suggesting. I am suggesting, she said gently, that you left the raffle not for air, but for the orchard. You knew Sir Matthew would be there. You had reason to speak with him, and stronger reason to silence him. The smile faltered. Inspector Cole stepped forward slightly. On what grounds? Mrs. Wren's voice remained calm. On several small things. The matchbook from Harcourt House, dropped near the broken branch, in the direction of the disturbed grass, indicating someone approached from the path Mr. Harcourt claims to have taken, and, most tellingly, the nature of the act itself. She glanced briefly toward Dr. Hargreaves. A precise method, something requiring knowledge, not merely of substances, but of their use. Leonard Pike looked up sharply. Yes, said Mrs. Wren. Mr. Pike possesses such knowledge, but not, I think, the courage. Mr. Harcourt, however, possesses both the motive and the temperament. Julian's expression hardened. This is absurd. Is it? Said Mrs. Wren mildly. Sir Matthew knew of your financial difficulties. More than that, he had discovered something that would not only ruin you, but expose others as well. Celia's breath caught. Julian turned toward her. You told? No, she said quickly. I didn't. But you intended to, said Mrs. Wren. That is why you arranged the meeting. You wished to persuade Sir Matthew to remain silent, or to come to some arrangement. She paused. Mr. Harcourt discovered this. Perhaps by chance, perhaps not. But he realized that if Sir Matthew spoke first, everything would be lost. Inspector Cole's gaze sharpened. So he came to the orchard ahead of Mrs. Harcourt. Yes, said Mrs. Wren. And when Sir Matthew arrived, expecting a private conversation, he received something else entirely. A long silence followed. Julian Harcourt let out a short, brittle laugh. You have a vivid imagination. Not at all, said Mrs. Wren gently. Merely a habit of noticing what does not quite fit. The inspector stepped closer. Mr. Harcourt, he said quietly, I must ask you to come with me. For a moment, and it seemed Julian might protest. Then something in his expression shifted, something resigned, almost relieved. Well, he said, I suppose it was inevitable. Celia closed her eyes. Around them, the village stood very still. Mrs. Wren turned slightly away, her task complete. How strange it is, she murmured to Mrs. Finch, that people will go to such lengths to prevent the truth from emerging, when it is the one thing that never truly stays hidden. The orchard lay quiet once more, but Barrow Street Jude would not soon forget what had been revealed there.